just get into the really rigorous psychological evidence at the start, because there's this branch of research that has taken different cohorts of people and given them a questionnaire to probe the way they conceptualize success. Effectively, the questionnaire is asking, where does high performance come from? In fact, that question is asked in a number of different ways to check for consistency of answer, so it makes it difficult to game. And this has been given to prop traders at investment banks, to NASA systems engineers, to clinicians, to aviators, to footballers. And broadly speaking, in answer to this question, you get two categories of answer. Over here in what's sometimes called the fixed mindset, people say, well, to be really good at my job, or some dimension of skill within the job, it's largely, or for some people almost exclusively, about talent, having the right predispositions, the aptitude, the high IQ, the fantastic powers of reasoning, the right kind of genetic inheritance. And if you want to have a successful team or organization, you need to hire people of that ilk. And of course, this isn't completely false. I think most of us would agree that talent is a real phenomenon that explains some of the variation we see in performance in most areas of human activity. But over here in what's sometimes called the growth mindset, people say, whilst talent isn't irrelevant in a complex world, it isn't enough. And they're focused on other ingredients that are also predictive of success, like disciplined practice, constant evaluation, collaboration, and crucially a recognition that however good I am, even if I'm a genius, I can nevertheless get better. That turns out to be of incalculable psychological significance because it enables people to do something that is challenging, possibly even threatening, namely learning from errors, from mistakes, from failures, and to use a slightly inelegant term, from suboptimality in all of its various guises. Now, this distinction between fixed and growth isn't quite as binary as I've made it sound. This is a continuum. But what makes this exciting psychologically is that depending on where people sit on this spectrum, and what's effectively their answer to one question, you can go and measure the behavior. And according to randomized double-blind controlled experimentation, which is a bit of a mouthful, but I was told to make sure I could get it across, this is rigorous social science, the behavior turns out to be radically different. And what remains of this presentation, I want to try and unpack what these two mindsets do in terms of driving institutional behavior, particularly in the context of system safety. And I know that you've heard already and are very familiar with the growth mindset culture in aviation, where there's a deep recognition that even though we're smart and talented and we have good processes, procedures, and protocols that we deploy in order to keep the system safe, there is a certain fundamental sense in which these are suboptimal. They're not as good as they might be. Not because we lack intelligence, but because of the complexity of the phenomena when you're trying to keep a nonlinear dynamic system safe. And this orients the minds of the professionals in the industry to the learning opportunities that are always out there, but are so easy to neglect. So as you know, when pilots almost hit each other in midair on the tarmac, a near-miss event, they openly and voluntarily, transparently submit a report. Dozens are filed around the world every hour, and these are analyzed in their statistical totality to figure out what are the weaknesses in our assumptions that are leading to these near misses. What could we rationally do differently to avert an accident before it's even happened? So second by second, minute by minute, hour by hour, they are learning the lessons to drive a dynamic process of change. And beyond healthcare, you'll have heard about the importance of adaptability and agility. And my pitch to you really is that these organizational qualities emerge quintessentially from underlying cultural and psychological assumptions that map onto the growth mindset. And what if, God forbid, there's a crash, the most serious form of system failure? If you're anything like me, it's quite difficult, isn't it, to confront and interrogate our failures, particularly if we're supposed to be smart and talented and senior and highly competent. But early in its history, as was said in that kind introduction, aviation created a mechanism that makes its failures data-rich, the black box. One records the electronic data, the other records what's called the ambient sound, how the pilot and co-pilot were interacting in the build-up to the crash. So when an accident happens, the investigation branch can rescue the boxes from the rubble of the crash, deconstruct what went wrong, and once again put reforms in place to ensure the same mistake never happens again. That to me is the anatomy of a learning organization. And as you know, it's had an incredible effect on the key metric, which is the accident rate, which was very high at the beginning of the last century. In 1912, more than half of US Army pilots died in crashes in peacetime. The early fatality rates at some of the military training schools were close to 25% annually. But decades of institutionalized learning, driven by this culture of continuous improvement and openness, led to a situation last year, don't know if anyone caught this on the news, the accident rate for the major airlines globally was 0. So the accident rate's now dropped to 1 crash for every 17 million takeoffs. And that's partly about the talent, but it's fundamentally about the culture. And I think what I've gleaned from being here the last couple of days is that healthcare doesn't quite have the same level of transparency. And a lot of the content has been about the problem of a very punitive culture, when clinicians anticipate being unfairly blamed or struck off or put on trial for culpable homicide for completely honest mistakes created by more subtle systemic weaknesses, they're less likely to volunteer that information. And I was very honored to work with Jeremy Hunt on the creation of the Healthcare Safety Investigation Branch and other reforms that are trying to get a better cultural consensus around drawing a rational line between blame and accountability. And perhaps we can, well, you've already heard a lot about that. I want to bring up a related but separate issue. And I hesitate to say this, but I'm going to say it anyway, which is there's something quite deep in clinical culture, I don't know if you'd agree with this, that when you get to the top of the hierarchy, you're a consultant, the insinuation is, you're that talented, that brilliant, that audacious, you've had that long and expensive an education, that you don't really make that many mistakes, or you don't make mistakes. Jim Reason, the great safety campaigner, said that one of the problems in clinical culture was this notion of the infallibility of the senior doctor. I think that's one of the things that makes it difficult for junior people in the team to speak up when they can see something going wrong. That hierarchy gradient is partly constructed upon the idea that the person at the top of it is the big cheese, the person who gets the answer right. And that sounds not too bad as far as it goes. Isn't it a good idea to have somebody there who is audaciously brilliant in their reasoning, clinical judgments, and so on? But I think it does hint at a potential cultural danger, which is what happens when there is a suboptimal outcome, when something goes less well than it could have done. Is it fair to say that's basically everything? You can improve on any given performance-related dimension through time with a few caveats. The most serious form of suboptimality, of course, being death, an opportunity to learn the lessons to make sure that the same mistake doesn't happen in the future, but you'll be fully aware of the observational studies of senior doctors talking to patients' families where there is a tendency partly towards concealment, which has been dealt with, I think, very brilliantly at this conference, but also self-justification. And think of the psychological dynamic. If I've been positioned as an infallible clinician, then that accident, that mistake can't be anything to do with me. It must be an unavoidable death, or a complication of the procedure, or just one of those things. This phenomenon of the fixed mindset making it difficult to create meaningful adaptation exists in many different industries. Perhaps a good way to highlight it is the domain of economic forecasting, where there's a very interesting objective finding by Philip Tetlock, the great American academic, that the high reputation forecasters, on average, make the worst predictions. Which sounds paradoxical. Why are the high reputation forecasters making less good forecasts? And so, by the way, high reputation as measured by how often they visit TV studios. And you can see the problem. What is an error of forecasting? It's an opportunity to revise or enrich one's theoretical assumptions, because the model that drives the prediction is not the system itself, it's a simplification that permits prediction, and there is a signpost about how it can be reformed to make it more robust and predictive in the long run. Scientific method. But the high reputation economists don't like to admit to their mistakes, so they come up with these tortuous ex-post rationalizations for why they were right all along. And because they're intelligent, these self-justifications have superficial plausibility. They delude both the economist and his or her clients and torpedo the adaptive process. There is rigorous finding in social science of a negative correlation between some talent metric like IQ and performance, or seniority and performance, when people are in the wrong mindset. Because suboptimality is not seen as an opportunity to grow and adapt and make deeper sense of the phenomena that one is engaged with, but an opportunity for creative self-justification. The growth mindset isn't saying that talent doesn't matter. We want to have talented people. It's about liberating the talents to constantly find ways of improving through time in the way that science has changed our world. Am I going off on one here? Just to take us out of the healthcare context, I spent the day at the end of October with, does anyone know who the chief executive of Microsoft is? You used to be Gates, right? Then Ballmer. Does anyone know who the current CEO of Microsoft is? I didn't know who it was. Satya Nadella. It's kind of gone under the radar. Took over in 2014. Since then, the market cap of Microsoft has gone up by $360 billion, which is not bad, right? You like thinking big deal. I said, how did you manage to get this extraordinary change, this remarkable transformation? And he said, it's very simple. We changed the culture from a fixed mindset to a growth mindset. Microsoft, and he put it in these terms, and forgive the slightly naff language, Microsoft, because of its historic success, had become an organization of know-it-alls. Everybody wanted to look like the smartest person in the room. If you want to look like the smartest person in the room, what's the last thing you want to hear about? You don't want to hear about the deficiencies in the product line. You don't want to hear about what competitors are doing better, because instead of seeing that an opportunity to pivot onto something even better yourself, you think that shows they're smarter than us. If you've got a manager who's getting prickly and defensive about any aspect of suboptimality, can you see how that destroys the bottom-up flow of information that is so crucial to innovation in the high-tech age? He said we need to change the culture from an organization of know-it-alls to an organization of learn-it-alls. Because if you're a learn-it-all, you want to know where the deficiencies are in the product line. You want to know what the competitors are doing better. You want to hear all of that rich information because you see success not as static, not as having to defend the status quo, not seeing expertise as knowing it all already, but expertise as growing dynamically through time. And when you're in an area which is involved in quantum computing and mixed reality and deep neural networks and machine learning, you've got to have that attitude of adaptation. You've got to be prepared to make those changes and not to get defensive when somebody junior, a nurse, says maybe you could be doing this better.